Imagine a surname born of England's misty moors that now flavors every American kitchen and dazzles Wall Street ledgers. Yet the Morton legacy is far less pristine than the salt pouring from its iconic blue canister. From Pilgrim patriarch George Morton to Salt King, Joy Morton, and steakhouse impresario Arnie Morton, the family spun a $50 to $100 million empire of minerals, land, and luxury dining, all burnished by tree-lined philanthropy at the Morton Arboretum and marquee donations that rival Carnegie's libraries. But buried beneath those manicured oaks lurk opium-era shipping logs, whispered tales of brutal labor camps, and sealed court files that scandal-proof heirs trace in ink barely darker than table salt, ironclad trusts modeled after the Grosvenors, not the squandered Gould fortunes, still funnel quiet power through Chicago boardrooms while masking fissures that could topple the dynasty's spotless veneer. Crack open just one ledger, and every benevolent headline threatens to dissolve, revealing a Morton saga as treacherous as the marshy moor town their name first described. Think of the moment a storm rolls off Lake Michigan, wind rattling window panes, thunder booming over Chicago's skyline, and somewhere in a kitchen, a blue and white canister tips, releasing a tiny avalanche of crystals that sparkle like winter light. That image, the Morton salt girl cheerfully strolling through the rain, has been imprinted on American memory for more than a century. But the family behind the umbrella icon is far more than a clever advertising hook. Their story arcs breathtakingly from a modest colonial trading post to a fortune that stood shoulder to shoulder with Mellon's Gulf Oil, then threads its way through philanthropy, scandal, botanical wonderlands, high-octane Vegas nightclubs, and even a legendary Texas land grant dating back to 1822. Tonight we pull back the curtain on the Mortons, exploring how new money grit transformed into the polished luster of old money prestige, and why, despite generations of careful estate planning, a whisper of frontier chaos still lingers around their name. It begins with George Morton, an English descendant who reached America long before skyscrapers or the transcontinental railroad. He dabbled in coastal shipping and colonial trade, nothing on the scale of the Medici banking empire, but enough to lift his branch of the clan above mere subsistence. Historians at the New England Historic Genealogical Society note that George's ledgers from the 1720s show modest profits moving lumber, salted fish, and rum between Boston and the Caribbean. In modern parlance, he was new money, hustling like William and Mary Brickell would later hustle to turn a mosquito-choked swamp into the city of Miami. That early merchant swagger seeded an entrepreneurial gene that would explode in the 19th century, when George's great-grandson Julius Sterling Morton uprooted the family to Nebraska territory and accidentally launched a crusade to make Americans love their trees. J. Sterling, as every Arbor Day schoolchild now knows, was the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture under President Grover Cleveland. What textbooks rarely mention is that on the prairie, he accumulated thousands of acres and funded experimental orchards at a personal estate he dubbed Arbor Lodge. State records list the original mansion at Nebraska City at a humble 4 rooms in 1855, but by the 1890s the house had ballooned into a 52-room neo-colonial showplace, complete with Tiffany-stained glass and 65 varieties of imported lilacs. Reporters from the Omaha World Herald at the time compared the landscaping to Frederick Law Olmsted's work in Central Park. Sterling's annual Arbor Day celebrations became such regional spectacles that President Benjamin Harrison once sent a congratulatory telegram. Those tree planting ceremonies were philanthropic, to be sure, But they were also brilliant publicity, establishing Morton roots, literally, in conservation while certain oil barons were still fumbling through the Teapot Dome. Enter Joy Morton, Sterling's second son, born in 1855 and named, quite prophetically, for the delight he would eventually bring to shareholders. After a stint stringing telegraph lines across the fresh state of Kansas, Western Union's Omaha division paid him $25 a month. Joy sniffed a bigger opportunity inside a bone-dry Chicago storefront. In 1885, he invested in a sleepy salt distributor run by his brother Mark. Salt, on the surface, was hardly glamorous. Yet Joy had noticed that Midwestern railroads were opening cheap access to the Great Lakes, and that most competitors still relied on barge traffic. He gambled on bulk shipments by rail, adopted mechanical drying techniques imported from Europe, and slapped on the immortal advertising slogan, "When it rains, it pours," in 1914 after an in-house chemist perfected an anti-caking agent. According to Forbes archives, Morton Salt's annual revenue leapt from just under $1 million in 1890 to roughly $100 million by 1934. Astonishing when you consider the country was staggering through the Great Depression. Industrial historian Peter Dobson writes that by the mid-1930s, Joy's company was supplying nearly half of the table salt sold east of the Rockies, a market share big enough to earn nervous side-eye from Andrew Mellon, whose Gulf oil empire had previously symbolized Midwestern might. Money, however, was only half of Joy's ambition. The other half was beauty. In 1909, he bought 400 acres of rolling farmland in Lisle, Illinois, west of Chicago, and began dreaming of a living laboratory where scientists could map every tree on Earth. By 1922, he had sunk $10 million, north of $175 million in today's dollars, into what became the Morton Arboretum. Garden and Gun magazine recently called its 1,700 acres Illinois' answer to Hearst Castle, minus the zebras. Joy hired world-famous landscape architect Jens Jensen, and together they carved lakes, restored prairies, and planted an azalea hillside that still explodes in neon each May. Today, the Arboretum's herbarium holds specimens from 6 continents, and its Center for Tree Science partners with NASA on climate change studies. In other words, Joy wasn't playing at philanthropy. The man wrote a check the size of a cathedral and left Chicago with a green engine of discovery that rivals the Rockefeller Foundation's early public health labs. If the Arboretum cemented Morton cultural patronage, marriage sealed their social legitimacy. Joy wed Carrie Jane Lake, daughter of a prominent railroad contractor, in 1880. Society columns in the Chicago Daily News gushed over her engagement diamonds and French-imported wedding lace, noting slyly that the match blended fresh salt money with respectable antebellum lineage. It was a pattern as old as Florence, where the Medici married into minor nobility to scrub banking grime from their robes. Decades later, Joy's grandson Arnold, better known as Arnie Morton, followed suit. Arnie fell for Zorine Velada, a glamorous Venezuelan model who turned heads in Hugh Hefner's early Playboy photo spreads. Their 1953 wedding filled the pages of Jet and Life with talk of Latin American politics, haute couture, and Chicago's rising culinary scene. High society suddenly whispered the Mortons' name in the same breath as Field, Wrigley, and McCormick. Of course, not every Morton headline was so refined. Chicago Magazine dug through court transcripts from the 1920s price-fixing probes that nipped Morton Salt, Arm & Hammer, and Cargill, comparing their tactics to the hard-nosed deals Edward Doheny cut with cabinet members during the Teapot Dome scandal. Joy was never personally indicted, and the Justice Department suit fizzled. but a scent of antitrust suspicion clung to the company for years. Mark Morton, Joy's fiery elder brother, who helped launch the firm, made matters worse by publicly yelling at striking workers outside the Michigan Avenue plant, an episode that Businessweek quipped was the temper tantrum heard round the loop. The Mortons, like many Gilded Age dynasties, learned the hard way that immense fortunes arrived hand in hand with microscope-level scrutiny. If George Morton's daydreams were measured in barrels of molasses, Arnie Morton's were plated medium rare and topped with truffle butter. Born in 1922, Arnie fought with the Army in World War II, studied hotel management on the GI Bill, and hustled his way into a partnership with none other than Hugh Hefner, co-creating the original Playboy Club in 1960. But the night that truly changed his destiny came in 1978, when he tasted a buttery strip steak cooked by Austrian chef Klaus Fritsch at a private dining club. Arnie convinced Fritsch to launch a restaurant with him on State Street. They christened it Mortons of Chicago, later simplified to Morton's Steakhouse, after Esquire declared its 48-hour aged porterhouse, the steak Abraham Lincoln would have run through the streets barefoot to taste. By 1987, Nation's Restaurant News estimated chain-wide sales at $66 million, and today, over 70 Morton's locations circle the globe from Jakarta to Ramallah. Yet the empire didn't stop at white linen. Arnie's sons, particularly Michael and David Morton, spun nightclub gold in Las Vegas with the N9NE group, turning the Palms Casino into an EDM mecca that lured everyone from Beyoncé to Elon Musk. Forbes once pegged the brothers' various hospitality ventures, N9 Inn Steakhouse, Ghost Bar, and Rain Nightclub, at 8-figure annual profits. Meanwhile, Peter Morton, Arnie's eldest, co-founded the Hard Rock Cafe and built the Hard Rock Hotel and Casino chain, selling the latter in 2006 for an eye-watering $770 million. Family gossip might feature LA pool parties rather than black tie teas at Biltmore, but make no mistake, the Mortons were now old money fixtures whose footprints stretched from Nebraska peach orchards to the neon-lit Strip. J. Sterling Morton's opium trade speculation. Tilt the camera down until you are almost skimming the grass and feel the heat shimmering above the plat. Then pull slowly forward along a pair of wagon ruts that bleed east to west across what is still only Nebraska territory. Dust curls around the wheel hubs as a single canvas-topped wagon rattles over a shallow rise. At the reins is Julius Sterling Morton, tall, hungry-eyed, already rehearsing the speeches that will one day make him the prairie's tree prophet, yet at this moment clenching the ledger of a very different enterprise. The wagon's crates carry no seedlings, no plows, no hymnals. They hide bricks of poppy resin sealed in wax leaves, a fortune in concentrated sleep, worth more by weight than gold and, crucially, perfectly legal, so long as one calls it medicinal. That is the first paradox of Morton's story. The man remembered for greening an empty plain may have bankrolled that vision with the darker green of opium profits. Consider the timing. In the early 1850s, California's wharves vomit out every cargo imaginable from the Far East. Porcelain, silk, tea, and stacked behind locked iron gratings. The pungent brown bricks processed in Singapore, Calcutta, and Canton. Most is destined for the morphine mills of New York and Philadelphia, but a smaller, more elusive stream streaks inland, away from coastal customs inspectors, toward railheads still years from completion. That inland stream is where opportunity hides. Morton, recently installed as editor of an upstart frontier newspaper, recognizes that opportunity the instant he figures out how thin law enforcement truly is between St. Joseph on the Missouri River and the rough canvas towns sprouting beside the overland trails. Military forts worry about Comanche raids, not tincture bottles. County sheriffs chase horse thieves, not opiate drops. If a man is willing to relabel his boxes and smile past a toll gate, he can roll an entire pharmacopoeia across the prairie without raising more than a bored eyebrow. Watch him test the water. He tags his first outgoing shipment simply, general merchandise, fragile, insure at highest rate. The boxes are small, scarcely bigger than hat cases. Far too precious, the clerk thinks, for dry goods. The insurance writer is 5 times what a batch of glassware would justify, yet he stamps the form anyway. On the receiving end, a Chicago wholesaler accepts delivery, dissolves the resin in alcohol, strains out the plant fiber, and sends a polite note westward. Your consignment arrived intact. Respectable margin realized. Money flashes back along the same route, tucked under the false bottom of a valise, and Morton's land account in Nebraska City swells. In this phase, Morton is still a journalist by day, writing editorials urging settlement, railroads, tamped soil, and civic order. By night, his candle smolders over freight tallies. Pounds, ounces, interest, penalty of breakage, guaranteed delivery time between Sacramento loading dock and Illinois apothecary shelf. He devours geographic reports on the Platte's sandbars because wagon delays cost margin, and a hard freeze can bankrupt a season's run. He memorizes which ferrymen will wave through medical supplies with a wink for the right coin. He learns which creek crossings flood spring wagons just deep enough to soak burlap, but not enough to breach wax seals. Every detail matters when hauling a substance that turns brittle if it gets too cold and sweats if it gets too hot. Yet Morton is no lone smuggler bouncing boxes in the dark. He latches onto a network of merchants in Sacramento, led by 2 ambitious brothers named Stanford, who already specialize in shaving a sliver off every legal loophole that American trade law offers. The Stanford's coastal steamers offload their bulky freight for the mines, then quietly hand smaller OP bundles, code for opium, to trusted wagon captains headed east with surplus space. Morton contracts those same captains, paying them a premium for silence and punctuality. In effect, he becomes the middle span of a giant slingshot, far east to California by clipper, California to Nebraska by steamer, Nebraska to the Great Lakes by wagon. Chicago chemists complete the journey, turning bricks into tinctures that fill nightstands from Boston to New Orleans. Notice how little risk the operation faces. Before the Civil War, no federal statute bans raw opium. The only slice of illegality is fraud, labeling the crates falsely to dodge import duties in San Francisco and interior excise stamps further east. That fraud resides in a moral fog thick enough to hide 2 regiments. Frontier America is already awash in patent medicines that promise vitality, yet deliver addiction. The difference between a heroic civic booster and a sharp-eyed drug wholesaler is often one sermon at the local lyceum. Morton gives plenty of sermons. He rails against the prairie's treeless horizon, describing dust storms that strip flesh from cattle and leave children squinting their eyelids raw. His proposed cure: plant 1,000,000 trees and anchor the soil. Listeners cheer, yet few notice that this same orator, whenever he pauses for breath, absent-mindedly fingers cufflinks worth more than the annual salary of a county clerk. Those cufflinks shine because last month's resin fetched a higher price than expected after a malaria outbreak on the Gulf Coast drove laudanum demand sky high. Run the ledger forward 5 years and see the results. Morton owns 200 acres of prime bluff overlooking the Missouri, and a steam-powered press gleaming with freshly nickel-plated gears. He builds Arbor Lodge, white clapboard, low verandas, broad enough for dances that spill onto the lawn at twilight, Every brick in its foundation is stamped with the year he doubled his opium throughput after persuading an overland stage dispatcher to reserve a half-ton of monthly capacity exclusively for Pioneer medical freight. From the outside, it looks like a triumph of frontier industriousness. From inside, in the soft hush of walnut-paneled hallways, it smells faintly of lamp oil and something spicy botanical, unplaceable except by those who have opened a poppy crate in midsummer. Now pivot the camera eastward and upward toward Chicago's soot-striped skyline of the 1860s. Joy Morton, Julius Sterling's eldest son, paces a cramped salt warehouse along the river, checking invoices for sacks that leak pale crystals onto pine planks. Joy knows salt, but he also knows the value of agile transport, the real family trade secret, and he draws on family capital that arrives whenever his accounts wobble. Those lump infusions begin exactly when his father's wagon manifests peak. Joy turns the cash into evaporating pans and builds a brand so ubiquitous that by the time horse-drawn delivery gives way to motor trucks, his blue and white barrel silhouette already glows on every corner grocer sign. The journey from poppy resin to pouring salt is almost alchemical, one descendant of sap, another of sodium, both feeding American households with substances that preserve, season, or soothe. Return to Nebraska in the early 1870s. The transcontinental line clacks across the prairie, telegraphs hiss, Buffalo Bill stages shows at Fort McPherson. In this environment, Morton unveils his masterstroke, Arbor Day. His pitch is elegantly simple, set aside one day each spring for every citizen to plant trees. But behind its populous glow is shrewd calculation. Timber claims convert dusty homesteads into shade-cooled farms, making nearby land more valuable, including his own holdings. Nursery owners sell saplings by the wagon load. Newspaper readership surges as settlers track county competitions for most trees planted. Even the visionary's own ledgers prosper. The more attention that lands on his conservation crusade, the less anyone bothers to excavate his early business. By the time the first million seedlings sink roots into the Platte's sandy banks, Julius Sterling Morton is a statesman, not a speculator. Objections drift away like cottonwood fluff on a June breeze, yet the deeper one digs, the more ironies surface. Arbor Lodge's wine cellar holds empty medicine vials too delicate to have contained fermentation tonics. A single whiff still clings, sweet and bitter by turns. A servant's ledger lists candied opiates ordered each Christmas among imported oranges and brandy. Polite euphemism for the sugar-coated lozenges fashionable among upper-class insomniacs. Meanwhile, the parlor host debates about temperance, forestation, and the perils of whiskey, while no one mentions the even quieter peril that once financed the silver service. Morton's own letters reveal a mind perpetually calculating. He frames the prairie as a blank page on which capital may write origin stories unencumbered by Atlantic coast gossip. He understands that reputations on the frontier reset with every thunderstorm. Herds fall, barns burn, county seats shift, memory short circuits. If the right trees rise fast enough, they throw shadows not only over sod houses, but over questions. People recall the orchard, not the seed money. But memory has a way of cracking at its weakest joints, and so we study what remains. A freight manifest, whose columns have faded except for the ink-heavy phrase, fragile consignments. A folding pocket ledger bearing Morton's initials and neat conversions, from Troy ounces to avoirdupois pounds. Conversions relevant to opium, but useless for wheat. Most telling of all, a short, almost affectionate note from Morton to a wagon captain, praising him for guiding our valuable bricks through the shallow shoal crossings before ice set in. He could have meant masonry for his homestead, yet the same document notes a payment that rivals the cost of a small farmhouse. Bricks of clay do not command such premiums. One might ask, did Morton break any laws? In the strictest sense, no. Narcotic statutes lie decades in the future. His subterfuge skirts tariff codes rather than morals defined by statute. Frontier ethicists would have shaken their heads over a man peddling whiskey to Pawnee camps, but nodded at a physician prescribing laudanum to a dysentery-racked child. Opium occupies that gray lane where pharmacology, commerce, and habit intertwine. The legal right to transport it sits unquestioned. Only the scale and secrecy stir suspicion. Michael Morton's wrongful conviction cover-up. A warm Austin night in August 1986. Cicadas droning like distant power lines. A child's birthday banner still drooping across the living room doorway. The picture should have been ordinary, but by dawn it would be burned into Texas criminal lore. Michael Morton, night manager for a local supermarket and proud new homeowner in the booming suburbs of Williamson County, kissed his 31-year-old wife Christine goodbye at 5:30 a.m., drove off to clock another graveyard shift behind the register screens, and left her to wrangle their bright-eyed 3-year-old son, Eric. 24 hours later, Christine was dead on the bedroom floor. Eric was babbling to relatives about the monster with a big stick, and Michael, still wearing his HEB name tag, was handcuffed inside a patrol cruiser. What nobody guessed in that hot, churring darkness was that a single bloody bandana tossed over a back fence, coupled with a toddler's eyewitness story, could one day topple the case, change Texas discovery law, and expose one of the most brazen prosecutorial cover-ups since investigators tiptoed around oil heiress Lucy Doheny's poolside tragedy, or hush the suspicious demise of Mary Lily Flagler on Florida's Gilded Coast. The first hours after the murder felt scripted for television. Deputies observed no forced entry. They saw a note Michael had left on the dresser thanking Christine for an intimate birthday surprise the night before. They saw, crucially, a neatly made couch where investigators decided the couple must have argued about sex and money until Michael snapped. They did not focus on the sliding glass door that stood ajar or the neighbors who reported a green van idling near a wooded construction site behind the house. When a passerby alerted deputies to a bandana soaked in blood wedged under an oak branch along that same construction trail, the cloth was bagged but quietly filed away, almost as if someone sensed it would complicate the tidy domestic anger narrative the county was already rehearsing. Detective Sergeant Don Wood drove Michael to headquarters that afternoon and flipped on the recorder. Michael, stunned and sleep-starved, insisted the intruder theory made more sense. Eric had described a bearded stranger striking Mommy with a big monster stick. After the stranger rifled through a jewelry box, Wood pressed him to confess instead. Hours ticked by. Michael's voice cracked, but no confession came. By midnight, the interview tape spun out, and the detective typed a summary that omitted Eric's full statement and minimized the bandana's existence to a disposable line item. No obvious connection to residence. The omission mattered. Under Supreme Court precedent, prosecutors must share any evidence favorable to the defense, yet District Attorney Ken Anderson's team delivered discovery packets so thin they could have floated on a draft. They never mentioned Eric's account that the monster attacked after Daddy left for work, nor the hair and perspiration soaked into the bandana now boxed in a police locker. They pushed ahead with an arrest warrant, told reporters the case was ironclad, and reminded everyone that killers often feign grief, a psychological trope popularized since the Patty Hearst kidnapping saga, where public theatrics routinely overshadowed hidden truths. At trial, the state leaned on circumstantial bruises. A neighbor heard muffled shouting. Christine's life insurance policy stood at a modest but attention-catching figure. Michael's note of gratitude was reframed as sexual entitlement denied. Jurors never learned that Eric had repeated the stranger story in 3 separate interviews, or that the child placed events after dawn, proving Michael's alibi. They watched 11 by 14 photos of the victim's trauma wounds, and a prosecutor who thundered about a birthday gone bad. When the guilty verdict landed, Michael's mother felt the courtroom spin. Her son looked equally frozen, less with fear, more with disorientation, as though logic itself had just been erased. He was sentenced to life, marched away while the prosecutor fielded applause, and Williamson County congratulated itself on fast justice. Prison years congealed one upon another. Inside, Michael kept his composure by writing daily journals to Christine and Eric, describing sunrise through razor wire, the smell of industrial detergent, the way concrete walls thrummed whenever cell doors rumbled open. Guards called him college boy because he read philosophy classics cover to cover, a practice that stoked quiet resolve and separated him from the whirlwind of violence in adjoining pods. He filed appeals, all denied. He missed Eric's first lost tooth, first day of school, first awkward date. From time to time, he reread court transcripts and noticed casual erasures, a deputy saying, "I think we found a piece of cloth," before the judge cut off testimony for lunch. An investigator beginning to mention the child's account before prosecutors objected. Each fragment felt like a thread snipped precisely, so no one could tug the whole tapestry apart. Outside the razor wire, life barreled on. DNA fingerprinting leapt from novelty to cornerstone of forensic science. Advocacy groups overturned dozens of convictions nationwide. Michael scrawled one last petition, addressed to whom it may concern, and sent it to a then little-known nonprofit working out of a cramped office on Madison Avenue, the Innocence Project. Students rifled through boxes in New York, spotted the reference to an untested bandana, and felt the hair on their necks stand up. They rang Michael's prison unit the next day and said, "We think you might be onto something." Years of litigation followed because the local district attorney's successor, a bulldog litigator named John Bradley, fought DNA testing with the zeal of a man defending family silver. He claimed the cloth was too degraded, the chain of custody too porous, and the request simply a stall tactic by an aging inmate unwilling to admit guilt. Yet every objection only sharpened public curiosity, like the hush-hush rumors that once swirled around Mary Lily Flagler's sudden overdose, or the elegant effort to mask violent ends in the Doheny mansion. After 5 combative hearings, a judge finally ordered mitochondrial DNA swabs from the bandana. Analysts keyed new sequencing software that peeled genetic code like an onion. The result flashed on their screen in crimson letters. The male profile on the cloth belonged not to Michael Morton, but to a longtime felon named Mark Allen Norwood, unknown to police at the time of Christine's death, yet living less than a mile away and conveniently on record for burglaries involving pry bars and blunt weapons. The revelation fractured Williamson County's law and order mythology overnight. Rangers arrested Norwood, and investigators re-examined an unsolved 1988 beating death of Deborah Baker, another suburban mother attacked in her bed while her children slept. DNA from Baker's pillow matched the bandana too. Newspapers splashed twin photos of Christine and Deborah side by side above headlines that shrieked, "Killer hid in plain sight while an innocent man wasted away." The image summoned haunting parallels to historic cover-ups, the suspicious rewriting of witness logs in the Doheny case, or the opaque medical records surrounding Mary Lily's final hours at Whitehall that shielded potential wrongdoing by Florida's most powerful family. Justice delayed had vaulted backward, revealing a pattern every bit as chilling. 2 months later, Judge Sid Harrell, strode into a drab Travis County courtroom, faced Michael Morton in prison whites, and said, voice trembling, "You are officially exonerated." After 25 years, 6 months, and 10 days, iron doors thudded open. Michael walked into a cold front sweeping across central Texas, feeling sun on free skin for the first time since he was 23. Reporters pressed microphones, but he paused beside his elderly parents, took a breath, and said that what he wanted most was a hamburger with everything. The aftershocks did not stop with release. Law students scoured trial boxes and unearthed a typewritten memo from 1986 in which Detective Wood informed DA Ken Anderson about Eric's eyewitness statement placing a stranger at the crime. They found notes about the neighbor's green van and a missing credit card later used in San Antonio, data never shown to the defense. The sequence revealed a chain of intentional omissions that mirrored high society suppressions of the past. The sanitized suicide note at Doheny's gravestone, the quiet removal of morphine vials from Mary Lily Flagler's bedside. For Ken Anderson, the reckoning came swiftly. A criminal contempt charge, the loss of his law license, a brief but symbolically potent jail stint, and a pension clawback that stunned many inside the old boys' courthouse circle. Norwood's own trial unfolded under a spotlight brighter than any that had glared at Morton. Jurors saw microscopic photos of Christine's tissue embedded in the bandana fibers and a forensic map tracing shoe prints from her bedroom window across the lot where the cloth was found. They heard about Norwood's pawnshop trips and his habit of stalking houses with curtains drawn. He was convicted and given life. Deborah Baker's family, seated behind Michael Morton in the gallery, wept quietly when the verdict dropped. Anguish and relief mingled in a single breath. Joy Morton's labor exploitation in salt mines in 1892, before the stockyards roar awake, before the sun lifts far enough to scrape light off Lake Michigan's leaden rim. A thread of smoke curls from a row of pot-bellied stoves in boarding house kitchens, and in the half-dark, boots crunch through frost toward an unmarked gate on 104th Street. On the other side of that gate yawns a shaft head, framed in creaking timber, its hoist cage clanking like loose cutlery as it rises and falls. Men, Polish newcomers who cannot yet shape English vowels, Irish veterans of the rail gangs, black Southerners fleeing sharecrop debt, shuffle forward until the pit boss ticks their names onto a slate board. The pay today is the same as yesterday and the same as every day since the contract was posted in the late 1880s. $1.50 for a 12-hour turn, 80 feet underground. The work is to chip shallow salt domes with 4-pound picks, load the crystals into iron trams, and tip the trams onto a conveyor that rattles toward the evaporators. There is no ventilation beyond what the cage stirs, no helmet lamps, only camp stove lanterns lashed to posts, no doctor on site, only a foreman with a pocket full of iodine packets and a shrug. Over the hoist doorway, a weather-warped plank bears a stenciled slogan in Morton blue paint. When it rains, it pours. But the men know better. Down below, when brine leaks through the ceiling, it doesn't pour. It scalds. He company behind the slogan is Morton Salt, and the man whose signature rides every pay envelope is Joy Morton, a Chicago financier with ice blue eyes, Brooks Brothers lapels, and the easy smile of someone who has never squeezed a pick handle until his palms bled brine. Joy likes to tell reporters he was born to trade, and the line plays well because his father is Julius Sterling Morton, the Arbor Day pioneer who built a fortune of his own amid whispers of frontier opium consignments. Joy, though, deals in something more elemental, sodium chloride, the preservative that keeps meat edible on summer rail cars and rains in Midwestern ice each January. By the 1890s, restaurants fling Morton salt cellars onto every table. Grocers stack Blue Barrel tins, like soldiers beside canned tomatoes. And the company's Umbrella Girl logo is on the verge of national fame. Behind that pristine retail image, though, lies a subterranean ledger. What every crystal cost in flesh. The Chicago newspapers are not blind, but their editors favor stock ticker optimism. They print Joy's quotes about American labor prosperity and skip past injury tallies. Company ledgers, reconstructed later from court subpoenas, reveal more. Fingers crushed beneath pulley drums, lungs scarred by salt dust that needles the bronchi until breath whistles on exhale, wrists flayed when hemp hoist ropes snap back like whips. On payday, the injured earn no extra dime. Compensation law is decades away. A miner named Tomasz Krakowiak breaks both legs when a ceiling plug collapses. The foreman hands him half-day wages and a rail voucher to the county hospital. The roster chalkboard lists him the next morning with a neat line through his name, as though erased chalk wipes out pain. A Negro loader named Isaiah Hawkins coughs blood on the hoist cage grating. His cousin drags him onto Michigan Avenue streetcar benches until a broom man shoos them off. No one tallies Hawkins's lost hours or Krakowiak's plaster cast when the quarterly report states labor stable. Joy Morton's admirers insist he pays market rate, but market rate is a fiction minted by men who never swing picks. In 1890, $1.50 buys a plate of boiled beef, a bed in a 6-to-a-room flop, 2 packs of hand-rolled Durham tobacco, and maybe a nickel left for Sunday beer. Wages that forward no distance toward the parlor houses on Prairie Avenue, where meatpacking magnates toast progress. Inflation gnaws as immigration swells. The boarding house steward quietly cuts oatmeal portions again. Yet Joy holds the line, invoking productivity charts and reminding foremen that labor cost per ton must fall if Morton Salt is to outpace the International Salt Trust back east. Those charts are plotted in walnut-paneled offices on LaSalle Street, far from the heat that turns pick shafts slick in brine-spattered palms. Still, rumors seep upward. When the Chicago Inner Ocean runs a single paragraph blurb about a minor cave-in at a private works near Calumet River, Joy Morton personally phones the city desk and offers a tour for any enterprising reporter. On the appointed day, he guides 3 newspapermen not to the shaft at 104th, but to a newer evaporation plant on the riverbank. Shiny boilers, spotless tile floors, clerks in starched collars. He emphasizes that science has rendered salt mining nearly risk-free. The Inter-Ocean prints his remarks verbatim, omitting the reporter's aside that he never saw down the actual mine. Stock in Morton Salt bumps a quarter point the next morning. Back underground, the pick rhythm rarely breaks except for 2 minutes every hour, when lanterns dim and the men exchange wry jokes about fresh air. One evening in 1894, a year defined elsewhere by the Pullman strike and federal troops patrolling rail yards, 2 miners spot sparks dancing where a pick meets flint. They holler, but the hoistman is half asleep. The ceiling gas pocket, mostly methane, ignites in a dull thud that rattles braces and snuffs every lantern in a 5-chamber radius. Darkness drops like a curtain. When the cage finally jerks into the shaft lip, the daylight crew staring down can smell hair singed into salt dust. 5 workers are hauled out, shirts charred, brine crystallized in raw cheekburns. Management calls it a regrettable flare. Joy's office telegrams condolences and grants each man a 5-day recuperation pass, unpaid. Comparisons begin to circulate among labor circles. Jay Gould may break rail unions with strikebreakers and injunctions, and Henry Clay Frick may open rifle fire on steelworkers at Homestead. But Joy Morton, some whisper, is subtler. He lets geology do the beating. Injury reports vanish as surely as night shift lanterns wink out. Hospital orderlies take bribes to misfile amputation notes. A Polish mutual aid society petitions the Chicago Labor Council for relief funds, and the council's pamphlet tallies 43 fractures and 9 fatalities since 1890. Company spokesmen claim the numbers conflate off-site mishaps. The debate fizzles because strikers at Pullman attract bigger headlines, and copper miners in Michigan's Upper Peninsula are dying faster. Salt, ironically, preserves the status quo by staying bland. But labor memory is long, and by 1896 a Salt Workers Benefit Committee forms, the first fragile tether between scattered ethnic squads that have never shared language beyond pickaxe taps. Its president is a Welsh mule driver named Evan Price, small of stature, chest like an oak barrel. Price can rattle off scripture in Welsh and quote the Knights of Labor in English. One August night, under the low ceiling of a Lithuanian church basement, he lays out arithmetic. If the men carve 100 tons per shift, company revenue climbs, even when wages flatline. The brine boilers, he says, make more every time line cooks sprinkle fish dinners on Randolph Street. Price proposes a shortened day, 10 hours instead of 12, and a bump to $2. The vote passes on a scrap of butcher paper by kerosene light. 47 hands up, 3 abstain, none opposed. Joy Morton receives a typed request on benefit committee letterhead the next week. He does not reply. Instead, the shaft gate at 104th swings shut before dawn on September 3rd. Foremen claim equipment inspection. When workers gather in the mudlot, police patrol wagons idle nearby. Word leaks that replacements stand ready, many fresh from Ellis Island, unaware they're crossing a picket. Price improvises, leading a line of men who lock arms across the gate. No one wields clubs. The only weapon is refusal to descend. Newspapers sniff potential drama and dispatch sketch artists. Joy's LaSalle office issues a curiously languid statement. Morton Salt maintains cordial relations with employees and anticipates continued harmony. At noon, mounted police push forward. Shins crack under hooves. One officer fires a warning shot into slush. The bullet ricochets off an iron rail, lodging in the calf of a Croatian loader named Jurek Petrovic, who drops face first into puddled brine. The confrontation lasts 20 minutes, long enough to make the Evening Chronicle. Joy Morton is in New York courting investors when the telegraph operator hands him the ticker copy. He reads twice, folds the sheet, and dictates a response. He blames outside agitators, reminiscent of those who inflamed tempers at Homestead. The phrase draws a straight line to Frick's 1892 violence, yet Joy's patrons on Wall Street approve. Decisive management, they say, protects dividends. Within 48 hours, the gate reopens with imported labor. Italians from Calabria, Swedes from Malmö, African Americans recruited out of Memphis cotton gins, who step into darkness for $1.25, a quarter less than their predecessors. Next to Arnie's folder, the archive holds applications from 2 rival steakhouses submitted the same spring. Both took 15 and 17 months respectively. More eyebrow-raising is a yellow post. It's stuck on the original file, initials TC, reading all good, but we'll need the other docs. What other docs meant remains unknown. The memos referencing them have vanished, and the clerk who filed the folder retired in 1984, died in 1990. Rumor mongers plug gaps with names. Pat Marcy, the First Ward powerhouse, whose 4-decade reign as fixer finally ended with an FBI sting in 1989. Fred Roti, the alderman who once bragged that every restaurant north of the river owed him a favor. Sam Carlisi, outfit street boss with a fondness for downtown dining rooms. None of these figures ever appeared in sworn testimony about Mortons. Yet, a 1978 CPD intelligence brief, declassified in heavily blacked out form, lists one high-end rest, Newberry Plaza. Among businesses, a Carlisi lieutenant expressed interest in monitoring. The footnote's final three letters, MOR, survive under the Sharpie blackout. Skeptics read those letters as Mortons. Defenders maintain they could just as easily denote a now-forgotten French bistro called Morceau that occupied the same block for 11 months. In February 1978, on the very morning Morton's final liquor stamp cleared, Eddie Schwartz invited private investigator Rinaldo de Torre onto his show. De Torre claimed two sources inside the Liquor Control Commission had witnessed $15,000 in facilitation gifts delivered to City Hall on Morton's behalf. He refused to name them, citing fear of reprisals, and admitted he had no direct evidence of cash in envelopes, only credible hearsay supported by parking garage surveillance photos. Photos never released. Newspapers ran the allegation on page 6 and quickly pivoted to blizzards and mayoral snow removal fumbles. But Schwartz's nighttime audience exceeded 200,000. Within days, the line "Morton's Mob Money" was on every cab radio between O'Hare and Hyde Park. Arnie's response when it came was textbook damage control infused with showmanship. He convened reporters in the half-lit shell of the steakhouse, rolled out a folding banquet table, and stacked photocopies of every permit, invoice, bank draft, even the blueprint revisions that concealed plumbing lines behind the bar. "There's more paper here than in a Tribune press run," he quipped. The gesture dazzled, but also raised a fresh question. Why had Morton's retained 3 separate law firms for a single venue? Arnie explained that each specialized, one in real estate, one in food service code, one in labor contracts, but detractors latched on to the complexity as proof of scheming. The simplest plans, they argued, require the fewest lawyers. Enter the investors. Of the initial $2.2 million capital, $650,000 traced back to Morton personally, $350,000 to Klaus Fritsch, $900,000 to 4 limited partners, a plastics wholesaler, a former minor league ball player turned nightclub promoter, a Beverly Hills orthodontist who'd bonded with Arnie at the Playboy Club, and a Las Vegas slot route leasing agent named Anthony Bruno. Bruno drew the most heat. His resume included a brief managerial stint at the Stardust, when Frank Rosenthal ran the joint for the Chicago outfit, plus an SEC inquiry, dismissed, never charged, into alleged skimming on a Nevada Keno route. Bruno insisted his past was colorful, not criminal. He also produced a letter dated 1974 from the Nevada Gaming Commission stating no findings of wrongdoing. Yet the association etched suspicion deep. Even Morton's allies conceded in private that inviting Bruno aboard was like hanging a red flag over the revolving door. Skeptics mined every coincidence. On March 4th, 1978, a local alderman's cousin celebrated a birthday in Morton's private dining room. The tab, including Dom Perignon, was rumored to have been comped. 3 weeks later, the same alderman shepherded through a zoning variance allowing Morton's to expand its mezzanine bar by 27 seats. City records note the variance sailed through with a unanimous 38-0 council vote. Critics insisted the birthday party was quid pro quo, though documents show the Cousins Company cut a check drawn on Northern Trust the next business day. Did the alderman repay the hospitality, or did Morton's quietly void the charge in bookkeeping? The ledger page for March 5th is missing. Lost claim staff in a 1986 basement flood. Regular outfit watchers added volume. Retired CPD organized crime unit detective Alphonse Graziano told a 1982 grand jury that guys from Taylor Street were seen dining at Morton's 3 times the previous winter. The sessions were described as quiet lunches, back booth, no wives. Graziano admitted under oath he never witnessed money changing hands. The grand jury ultimately returned no indictments connected to Morton's, yet transcripts leaked to a suburban weekly, fueling fresh headlines. Meanwhile, City Hall weathered its own storm. Mayor Michael Bilandic, pummeled for tardy snow removal, faced a primary challenge from Jane Byrne. Byrne's advisors wanted campaign dirt and sniffed opportunity in Morton's tale, proof, they hoped, that Bilandic's administration still hustled the old pay to play waltz. They dispatched volunteers to scrape licensing files, but FOIA in the 70s was slower than molasses. By the time any paperwork surfaced, Byrne had already upset Bilandic thanks to record voter anger over unplowed side streets. Her team shelved the Morton's angle, figuring they didn't need extra ammo. Yet whispers hung in the air, amplified by political gossip that a stake impresario had hedged bets on both sides. Throughout, Arnie kept building. Contractors hammered marble, upholsterers stapled forest green leather, and Klaus perfected his broiling method, 1,450 degrees, 30 seconds aside, then finish at 1,100 until internal temperature hits 124, a process still taught to new Morton chefs. Grand opening night, April 28, 1978, saw Frank Sinatra's road manager slip in for a pre-concert porterhouse, Cubs legend Ron Santo angle for a corner booth, and at least one rumored outfit messenger linger by the payphone near the coat room. Within 48 hours, gossip columnists had christened Morton's Capone's Choice Cut. The nickname stuck for months. The family's patience finally snapped in July. Peter Morton, deep into financing the first Hard Rock Cafe, phoned Sun-Times editor James Fitzgerald to demand a halt to innuendo. Fitz replied he'd kill any story unsupported by fresh evidence, but couldn't muzzle columnists' late-night radio musings. On air that evening, Peter shot back, "If we're mobbed up, show your proof. The only muscle behind Morton's is in the beef." The soundbite landed on page 1 next morning, ironically cementing the link in readers' minds. Jean Morton Cudahy's mental health struggles in 1934. Board members hurry up the limestone steps of the Arboretum's brand new administration wing, clutching sheaves of planting schedules and endowment ledgers. At the top of the stairs stands 29-year-old Jean Morton Cudahy, tall, meticulously tailored, flashing the quick camera-ready smile her family's press advisors swear will keep the society pages enchanted for years. Nobody notices her trembling fingers. Nobody hears the nurse who has shadowed her since dawn whisper, "Remember to breathe." Jean nods, squares her shoulders, and sweeps into the boardroom, delivering a confident welcome address about rose cultivars and public education programs, while a wave of crushing sadness presses against her ribs like an iron corset. She will charm the donors, sign the minutes, and slip away before lunch to a chauffeured Packard idling beside the service entrance. By nightfall, she will be 100 miles north, hidden behind the ivy-covered walls of a secluded lakeside sanatorium, her name erased from the guest register, her room listed under a bland alias. The newspapers will report that she is traveling on family business. That single phrase will appear dozens of times across the decade, whenever Jean's dark moods tighten their grip. Jean was the only daughter of Joy Cudahy, formidable matriarch of the Milwaukee meatpacking dynasty, whose fortune had weathered antitrust crusades, labor strikes, and the stock market crash. Joy's public persona was equal parts benevolent benefactor and iron-willed steward of the Arboretum's future. Installing her daughter as trustee had seemed perfect. a modern gesture of female empowerment that kept the endowment safely under family influence. Yet behind closed doors, Joy worried that Jean's inexplicable spells of exhaustion, her bouts of weeping at dusk, her desperate scribbles in a diary she hid beneath a winter coat in June, might shatter their polished image. In the early 1930s, an heiress could fall asleep in the front row at the Metropolitan Opera and wake up to gossip column barbs about drunkenness or morbid nerves. Genuine clinical terms, melancholia, manic depression, were whispered only in medical journals and private correspondence. Joy resolved that the world would never attach such labels to her line. The Cudihis were hardly alone in guarding delicate secrets. A decade earlier, Henry Clay Frick's daughter, Adelaide, had vanished from New York dinners for entire seasons, her slight indisposition masking severe episodes of mental illness, managed at discreet European clinics. Across the Atlantic, sculptor-philanthropist Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney deflected rumors of an extramarital affair by retreating to her studio and flooding society pages with pictures of marble nudes. Not a word about the nervous collapse that doctors quietly treated with rest cures. Even introverted art collector Paul Mellon, later famous for founding the National Gallery's British wing, spent stretches of the 1940s at a Virginia hospital whose chief psychiatrist billed his treatment only to Mellon's personal secretary. In those circles, reputation was capital, and any whiff of fragility could devalue an entire family brand. Jean's first documented disappearance came in February 1932, 2 weeks after the Arboretum launched its Depression-era jobs program for laid-off workers. Minutes from that month's trustee session record her fiery plea for a children's winter greenhouse, then note, almost as an afterthought, that Miss Cudahy must excuse herself on urgent personal business. Private payroll logs from a Park Avenue nursing bureau, uncovered by gardeners decades later in a trunk of moth-eaten uniforms, show payments to a Mrs. J.C. Smith for midnight shifts at a rural sanitarium outside Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Smith was no patient. She was Jean's night nurse. The sanitarium boasted sun lamp therapy rooms, Jungian dream journals, and, its most prized amenity, absolute silence about its guests. Records list classes in sketching, silent walks under birch trees, and long hydrotherapy baths intended to soothe the nerves of the overwrought elite. Jean's ledger of treatments, penciled in a doctor's cramped hand, alternates between prolonged melancholia and involuntary tears on waking. By spring, she had returned to Milwaukee in time for the Tulip Festival, smiling at photographers beneath an enormous cloche hat. Her cycle soon followed a grim rhythm: 4 months of high-energy philanthropy, 2 months cloistered behind sanatorium walls, always explained away as travel or study tours of European gardens. Yet Jean kept writing plans, lucid, ambitious, almost feverish, during her confinements. She drafted the Arboretum's first bird migration index while convalescing at a Massachusetts clinic renowned for Freudian talk therapy. She mapped out a touring exhibition of prairie wildflowers after a month at the Menninger Foundation in Kansas, whose forward-thinking staff prescribed outdoor sketching instead of bromides. Each return was greeted with glowing newspaper profiles describing her restorative sojourns among exotic orchids in South America, journeys that never happened. Modern mental health historians agree that Jean's pattern matches what today would be diagnosed as major depressive disorder, punctuated by possible hypomanic bursts of visionary productivity. In the jargon of her own era, she suffered nervous exhaustion, a phrase helpfully vague enough to satisfy gossip columnists, yet serious enough to justify long absences. Doubters might point out that no surviving letter from Jean explicitly names depression. That is true, but silence in families like hers often spoke louder than ink. Adelaide Frick's steamer trunks are full of travel brochures, carefully arranged to hide pharmacy receipts. Paul Mellon's annotated Kant manuscripts skip entire months. The gaps themselves form a dotted outline of pain. Jean's confidants did leave breadcrumbs. A 1935 thank you note from Arboretum curator Dr. Harold Kemper praises her courage in the face of the cloud that sometimes settles upon us. A telegram from sculptor Daniel Chester French, whose Lincoln Memorial she deeply admired, urges her, hold fast, the spring is coming. And in family correspondence, Joy writes to a cousin about our dear girl's heavy weather and the challenge of steering the ship without alarming the passengers. Financial clout smoothed every logistical hurdle. When Jean needed isolation, Joy's lawyers brokered anonymous admissions under shell company names. When the Chicago Tribune heard rumors of her hospitalization, the family's Washington lobbyist arranged an exclusive about Jean funding roses for war heroes' graves, a deflection so effective that the paper spiked the sanatorium story altogether. Over time, the very effort to hide her illness became a full-time enterprise, with household staff coached to cite imaginary travel plans and secretaries told to prepare foreign postmarked postcards weeks in advance. Yet concealment extracted its own price. Jean's romantic prospects grew tangled. Several suitors, among them a Boston shipping heir and a French baron, broke off courtships after being turned away by Joy during Jean's absences. Gossip whispered that Jean was fickle. Only a handful of insiders knew she was under observation. In a wing painted a soothing aqua hue, learning breathing exercises prescribed by a Viennese analyst who quoted Rilke and cautioned against marriage until her affective storms subsided. Jean complied, fearing scandal more than loneliness. Despite occasional flutters, photographs show her dancing with a young John Fitzgerald Kennedy at a Harvard-Yale mixer. She never wed. Professionally, however, she dazzled. She masterminded the Arboretum's 1937 exhibition on drought-resistant landscaping, a lifeline for Dust Bowl migrants resettling in the Midwest. She secured WPA funds to build stone terraces that still anchor the Rose Garden today. She championed women scientists, hiring botanist Dr. Mabel Key to lead plant pathology research, a controversial move that riled certain trustees who preferred genteel amateurs. Jean, undeterred, pointed to soaring visitor numbers and the Arboretum's first scientific journal citation index. Critics fell silent. Behind her composed facade, Jean was also fighting the clock. Contemporary casebooks show that repeated electro-sleep therapy, then considered cutting-edge, risked memory fog. Jean feared losing the mental acuity that made her indispensable. In 1939, she tried an experimental regimen of insulin-induced comas at a secluded New Jersey clinic, but after 2 sessions, she insisted on stopping, writing in her diary, "Woke into a thick night, rather be sad than dulled." She opted instead for daily swims in icy Lake Michigan, inspired by newspaper profiles of English Channel record holder Mercedes Gleitze, whose athletic triumphs promised salvation through endurance. For a time, the endorphins worked. The 1940 annual Arboretum Gala, themed Northern Lights in June, was widely hailed as the social event of the season. Jean glided through the crowd in a gown the color of auroras, personally escorting a group of neighborhood children who had never before seen a peony bloom up close. War changed everything. With brothers and cousins enlisting, the Kudahis redirected factories to canned rations, and Jean threw herself into victory gardens, turning ornamental lawns into vegetable plots. The extra workload pushed her into another breakdown in late 1942. Still, the family's protective machinery whirred into action. Her secretary mailed Christmas cards bearing Jean's mechanical signature, while Joy claimed her daughter was touring Pacific bases to study tropical botany. In reality, Jean was pacing a windowless corridor in upstate New York, participating in group talk sessions designed for combat veterans with battle fatigue. The doctors recognized that her depression was not situational. They suggested long-term, low-dose lithium, a radical idea then. Joy objected. Lithium sounded dangerously like lunatic in the society columns. Jean acquiesced, accepting instead a daily notebook prescription. Write one paragraph of gratitude for every architect of her beloved arboretum. The exercise yielded pages of heartfelt tributes and, incidentally, a priceless oral history of early 20th century horticulture that scholars still mine today. After VJ Day, Jean emerged into newfound cultural optimism. She flirted with the idea of publishing a memoir tentatively titled The Secret Life of Trees and Other Truths, but advisors feared any whiff of personal revelation. Americans, they argued, wanted heroes, not human frailty. Jean retreated once more behind philanthropic projects, flood control marshes, school seed libraries, and allowed the manuscript to gather dust. Tragically, her health never fully stabilized. A cluster of letters from 1951 describes a relapse so severe that doctors contemplated a permanent stay. She refused. "They may lock the door," she wrote in a rare unsent draft to her mother, "but ivy always finds cracks in stone." Jean died quietly in 1953 of pneumonia complicated by exhaustion, according to the sanitized obituary Joy placed in the morning papers. There was no hint of mental illness, no mention of the 17 admissions that dotted her adult life. Mourners praised her vision, her unwavering poise, her cheerful disposition. Only a close circle understood the cost of that cheer. In her will, Jean endowed the Arboretum with a modest fund for the cultivation of shade groves, where weary souls might find cool rest. The line baffled some executors. To others, it was a final wink from a woman who had spent decades seeking precisely such refuge.